So what I'm going to be doing in a couple of these videos is I'm going to be showing some positive proofs for Sunni Hadith scholarship and specifically why Hadith should be relied upon. And so this pertains to more skeptical people who really don't know the value of Hadith when it comes to historical investigations, and as well as any historical value that like a Hadith may have. It also applies to some of the Muslims who are curious in general about why hadith are given that much attention to in a historical context. But a lot of these arguments are going to stem from an individual whose name is Ammar Adil, and I suggest you guys check him out. And so in this particular video, I'll go over what's known as stylometry, which is stylometry is like a technique that's used in analytical and research, and which involves like analyzing a text to determine who the author of that text is. What stylometric studies do is they look at specific patterns like vocabulary, like syntax and stylistic features within a text, and it makes the case that this particular text was most likely written by individual. And so it's been used multiple times in like criminal cases to find the author of a manifesto. It's also been used like in literature. So a lot of stylometric studies have been done over Shakespearean type texts in order to determine Shakespearean authorship. But it's also interestingly been used in biblical scholarship as well. And there's a number of studies coming out that show stylometric features when it comes to the letters of Paul and whether or not they could be attributed authentically to Paul himself. So in general, stylometry is a well-established kind of area of research, and it's a well-known, sophisticated method that's been used numerous times throughout history when it comes to research on textual basis traditions. With regards to hadith scholarship, a number of stylometric studies have been done that go over a lot of the canonical hadith books. And the idea here is that they show that the text of Sahih Bukhari, as an example, solidify or delineate a single stylistic feature. And so what that implies is that the words in Bukhari are similar enough to suggest that they were written or produced by one particular author, or they're said by one particular individual. And so some of the studies that I'm going to be showing will go over a number of different methodological techniques that are used. And so we'll see like fuzzy C clustering and hierarchical clustering as just examples. But yeah, I think this slide here represents the different overview stylistic features that individuals or researchers use to determine how specifically this works. And another thing that should be clear here is that if there is this consistent single authorship found within all six canonical books, that should be quite telling because hadith have this, they transcend time and geography, right? For example, the works of Muwatta Malik, they were transmitted across different regions and different eras in completely different parts of the world. And really, the only common denominator or the common link within all of these isnads is the Prophet Muhammad himself. The kind of the idea in all of this is that if we can find a common link that is established within all of these hadith works, and that we can stylistically determine that the hadith works themselves have a single author, then that gives us credence, at least under the principle of parsimony, that the common link is the source for all of this similarity, right? So if we can identify a single author, it's most likely going to be the Prophet Muhammad. Okay, so a lot of the studies that I'm going to be showing, there are authored by an individual named Dr. Salim Saud, and some of his biography or dialectual works are written here. And a lot of the works that we're going to be showing are either based off of his direct research or are to some extent using his research to as a backbone to build off on that subject. So with regards to the first study, I'm going to be linking all of the citations on the screen, and you guys can go ahead and go over the studies in each and every study that kind of talks about how the whole system works and how the investigation goes through. what the methodology is, what the conclusions are of the study. But what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be breaking down the abstract for some of these studies and giving you a gist of the argument. If we can continue with regards to the second study, this was done in 2012. And Dr. Saud, he published the study focusing on authorship's classification. And this involves using hierarchical clustering as a feature of linguistic analysis. And it determines whether the Quran and Hadith have the same author. So this is important because what we want to start with is pretty much whether or not the author of the Quranic corpus is the same or is different from the author of the Hadith corpus. And so if you can show that there is a significant differentiation between the Quranic corpus and the Hadith corpus, then what we can at least at the very least show is that the Quran has an author who is not the Prophet Muhammad, or the Hadith has an author that is not the author of the Quran. The results, I've delineated the results below, but it shows that there's a clear stylistic distinction. And while both texts they seem to have religious kind of language, their authorship signatures differ, which is again a robust result when it comes to determining that there's two different writing styles here. So again, this goes over kind of the results here, and it's showing that there's an implication of two different authors, the one for the Quran and one for the Hadith corpus. The writing style in each text is unique enough to distinguish them from each other, which is kind of like the point of the analysis. And it also shows that any segments taken from a single text, they exhibit consistent stylistic traits to suggest that text has a single unified author. And so some of the other studies that I'm going to be showing kind of echo that last point, but it's definitely a really crucial study to have. So with regards to this third study, this was published in 2012, and here we see author discrimination, which is another feature of stylometric analyses. So the Quran was analyzed in its entirety, while segments from Sahih Bukhari specifically were chosen as a comparison basis. So as Bukhari as the control group, what they're doing is they show with something what's known as global and segmental like analyses. They show that again the stylistic differences are significant enough to warrant two separate authors for each individual corpus. So once again, they show there's internal consistency, and they show that there's different authors. And again, the implication in all of this is that Muhammad could not have composed the Quran, or at the very least, the authors of the Hadith corpus were not the same authors of the Quranic corpus. Now, with regards to the fourth study, this was done in 2014. This one it used a unique method in stylometric analyses, and it used what's known as it used artificial intelligence and text mining techniques, right? So what this does is it treats the Quran and Hadith not just as a static text, but rather as a data to be clustered. This goes basically, the conclusions are exactly the same, which is that there are two distinct authors, and that the authentic preservation of the prophetic words, those clusters themselves have a different stylistic pattern than the clusters of the Quran. Once again, the conclusions in all these studies are the same, but they're arriving at different the same conclusion through different methodological means. So in this study, they implement visual analyses, which makes it separate from the other one, because now you can actually see the hierarchical clustering and the fuzzy C model clustering, which are both techniques that were used in the study design. And so what they show is that, I think the next slide has a graph on it, but what they show is that there are clustered features within the two corpuses, and that those two corpuses are scattered and distinct, which again show that there are two different authors responsible for the clusters. So yeah, this goes over kind of the results of the hierarchical clustering, as well as the dictogram that will be shown in the next page. But like I said, all the conclusions are pretty much the same. The dictograms show that there's large distinctions between the Hadith and the Quranic corpus, and there's no visual stylistic overlap. So once again, that kind of, I think right here, this kind of demonstrates the point that there's two specific clusters and there's no visual overlap. And yeah, once again, they show that there's two separate stylistic styles. Now, in this study, there was 14 specific Quranic segments, and what they do is they compare that to Sahih Bukhari, and it's I think it's about 11 segments from Sahih Bukhari. But what they show in this case is once again there are different features, and they some of them exhibit similar patterns, but there's really no confusion between the two sets of clusters. And to be more specific with regards to the results, they show that different authors of the Quran, there are different authors of the Quran based off of the thematic styles of the works, and there is a uniform style within each book segment as well. So that's important because that kind of shows that there is this internal consistency within the Quranic corpus and within the Hadith corpus. And I think some of the later studies will go over the stylometric analysis between Sahih Hadith and Da'if Hadith, which is in of itself quite telling because internal consistency is a well-established way of determining whether or not a particular hadith has been subject to fabrications. So in this study, what they do is they broaden their analysis and they look at text size rather than what the text actually conveys. And so they used varying lengths of different texts from 100 words to 3,000 words, and to see the classification of how accurate the changes were. And what they kind of show is that it's not just Bukhari in this case. They actually used all canonical six books, but what they show is that there is like different text lengths and text segments that make it really obvious that the stylistic features of the two corpuses are different. So what that means is essentially things like sentence phrase, sentence structure, or sentence length are highly significantly different comparing the two corpuses, which again signify different authors. Now, in this study, author identification was established using what's known as the SMO-SVM classifications or classifiers. And you can Google it or you can just read the study. But again, they show in this case that there are these hierarchical clusters that significantly differentiate from the clusters of the other corpus. And once again, this is arriving at the same conclusion, but using different methodological means, whether that be AI or other kinds of classifiers. The point is that, at least computationally speaking, there are valid conclusions that show distinct authorship. Now, the ninth study goes over seven, not just hadith books, but specifically just random Arabic features or Arabic standard books. And the reason for this study was to show that stylometric analyses are so one of the flaws of stylometric studies is that it's very contingent on the specific language that you use, right? So it's like Aramaic, for example, or Syriac. Those are really rudimentary levels of language where stylometric analyses are not really strong enough to pick differences between them. But what this study showed was that Arabic, especially like dialectal Arabic, is not like those other languages. They're not rudimentary in that sense, meaning that there's been enough development within Arabic that stylometric analysis they could show valid conclusions, right? So they examined character trigrams, words, and word bigrams, and they made clusters using the same method, which is the MLP SVM method. And again, they showed that it's the consistency here is that the Quran and Hadith have their own unique styles of clusters. The 10th study is really the same thing, and they show the same conclusions. Now, continuing on to the whole theme of stylometry, there's also this whole notion of Sahih Hadith versus fabricated Hadith. So it's not just merely the fact that the Quran and Hadith have separate styles of writing, but also we can see that there are separate styles of writing between a authentic hadith as well as a fabricated hadith. And again, that shows that at least when it comes to authentic hadith, there is an internal consistency that signifies one author. So Orientalists have often questioned the reliability of hadith for centuries, and Muslims utilize what's known as the sanad system or the chain of transmitters to analyze the veracity of the hadith. Now, stylometry adds like a modern layer, a kind of somewhat of a computational layer by providing a basis for a textual basis for whether or not a hadith is fabricated or authentic. And again, it does this by comparing the clusters of fabricated hadith by the clusters of Sahih Hadith. And it shows that there is internal consistencies within these clusters that make zero overlap, right? Or they have significantly less overlap, which again implies that fabricated hadith do not have the same author or have a uniquely different author than the authentic hadith corpus. So the first study is this 2022 study, which highlighted once again the computational method of hadith authenticity. And so the researchers built a corpus of 3,600 authentic and 3,500 fabricated hadith, and they tested various machine learning algorithms. This study itself was pretty interesting, and it showed with a accuracy of 78% that the word n-grams in the Bayes multinomial naive analysis showed that there is a huge potential for fabrication within one cluster rather than the other cluster. Definitely check the study out. This one I think is quite eye-opening, and yeah, once again, it just goes to show that hadith can be created as authentic and fabricated based off of the text of the hadith itself. So the second one kind of mimics the same thing. At this time, it uses what's known as the MAHADDAT database. And again, it clusters fabricated hadith as well as authentic hadith. And what's interesting about this one is that it separates the two based off of a BERT model, right? So BERT is this one machine learning algorithm that sees through the corpus, and it essentially tries to categorize whether a hadith is fabricated or not. And what's interesting is that based off of the score, which is a 92% F1MH score, what that showed was that the machine algorithm was able to find internal inconsistencies within the hadith and classify them based off of fabrications or authentic hadith 92% of the time, which is remarkable, especially since the hadith corpus was quite large. It was almost like 4,000 hadith. Now, this slide is somewhat interesting, but we could go over it. Essentially, what it's showing is that we have this Orientalist scholar named Joshua Little, and he also mimics the same. He makes the same points with regards to stylometry, and I think it was just an interesting thing to pull out here. Now, as just a last slide, what this shows again is one of those diagrams that kind of go over Quranic clusters and Hadith clusters. And again, the point here is that within the entire Hadith corpus, there are narrations that seem to have a unique stylistic feature that are different from other narrations within the same Hadith corpus, as well as from Quranic corpuses. And the robustity of this argument is in the fact that when it comes to Hadith, all of them have, again, they transcend geographies and they transcend regions. And that's important because the common link within all of these Hadith chains is the Prophet Muhammad, right? He's the narrator, and you have multiple different transmitters. So under the principle of parsimony, if we can establish that there is a common link within every single unique stylistic feature, then we have sufficient evidence to not only make the case that there's only one author, but that the one author is Muhammad himself. So yeah, this kind of wraps up the argument of stylometry for hadith preservation. In some of the other arguments, we're going to mention a couple other forms of hadith preservation and arguments that support those, such as the companion mushafs and the manuscript evidence as well. So yeah, just stay tuned for those.